Thank you, LaDon. Catfish is a big industry here in Alabama, as it is throughout the southeast, and John Jensen is going to try to explain to us some of the production techniques and some of the things that it takes to get into the catfish industry. John?
Thank you, Michael. Catfish industry has grown tremendously over the last few years. In fact, it got its start here at Auburn University in 1957 when Dr. Swingle, a professor at Auburn, wrote a journal article that claimed that because of his research, he thought that the catfish had good opportunities for commercial aquaculture production. In 1960, the first commercial catfish farm began, and the industry has continued to grow ever since. It now is the third most commonly harvested type of seafood in the United States, and it is the fifth most commonly eaten seafood in the United States. And that is showing that the consumers have really reacted positively to the good quality of its meat and its good taste. The growth has gone tremendously fast. In fact, in 1979, there were only 40 million pounds of catfish produced, and in 1992, we produced 457 million pounds. There are several things that we have to be successful in the catfish business. One is a correct climate. We have to have a warm climate. Even though catfish are native all the way to Canada, they grow best in a temperature which is 85 degrees. And the area of the United States which has these temperatures, of course, is the southern tier of states in the United States. This also means that it's possible to grow them in tropical and subtropical regions. Of course, as the water is warm, the feed that's fed to the fish is metabolized quicker at warm temperatures, and the fish gain weight faster at these warmer temperatures. There are several other ingredients that you have to be successful in the catfish industry. And the second one that is very important is the types of soil and terrain. The soil must have a good clay quality. The clay should be at least 20% so that the ponds hold water. Ponds are usually the way we produce catfish in the United States. We like flat terrain where we can build ponds of any shape and size, usually somewhere around 10 acres, so that we can seine the ponds from one end to the other. We like them about 3 to 6 feet deep. Flat terrain is very, very good for building catfish ponds. The way we build these ponds is with construction equipment, rubber-tired equipment, four-wheel drive tractors, pans, and laser-guided equipment. And the cheapest type of construction is to dig down in the center of the pond area, getting the soils to put on the levees. This way, you remove soil from the center and do your cheapest type of construction. Watershed ponds can also be used where we cross a dam across a hollow and intercept rainfall. This works well. The third most important ingredient for success in the industry is to have enough water, and we do use a lot of water. Well water is best, but other types of water can be used. Well water is good because you don't have any contaminants. Watershed runoff works well too. The water is virtually free, but it's undependable, yet it is something that we can use to produce catfish in the United States. Unfortunately, for an investment in catfish, it takes a lot of money. You need to get together with your banker, put together a plan, work with the banker to understand the viability of your project. It takes a tremendous amount of operating capital, between $2,500 and $3,500 per acre. This goes for earth moving, drains, water supplies, feed bins, trucks, tractors, aerators, and other types of equipment. It also requires a tremendous amount of operating capital. And the type of things that we use in operating a catfish farm is feed, mainly. In fact, half of the cost of operating a catfish farm is in the feed. Another major cost is fingerlings. And there continue to be other costs, of course, in chemicals and labor and such. If you don't have a market for your catfish, it doesn't do any good to grow them. And most people think of a market in the catfish industry as a processing plant. Processors operate within a 50 to 100-mile radius in most parts of the southeast. If you're not within this sort of an area, a radius, you can also produce catfish and sell them through what we call niche markets. Usually we require a small-scale processing plant or a roadside-type market. In the large markets, these fish are loaded onto trucks and sent all over the United States. In fact, these fish now are being sent overseas in our export trade, and we look forward to an increasing acceptance of catfish around the world, which will allow this industry to continue growing. Another major market outlet in the United States is fee fishing. People in the United States love to fish, and catfish is a great fish to stock in ponds and catch out. This provides the owner a lot more income because of the cost of the fish fished by the fishermen. Management is a key in catfish farming, as it is in all aquaculture. You've got to know how many fish to stock in a pond, and the risk depends on how many you stock. You need to know when to feed, how to feed. Feeding takes place all year long and is very intensive during spring, summer, and fall. If you don't feed your fish, they won't grow, and this is one of the biggest mysteries for all fish farmers. It's also important that you monitor oxygen. As this is a feedlot operation, the wastes are ending up in the pond, and the wastes cause all kinds of water quality problems, one of them being oxygen, others being ammonia and nitrite problems. We also have to monitor alkalinity, hardness, carbon dioxide, and other water quality factors. If you don't have the support for the industry, it's hard to make the industry grow or help the industry grow. Here in Alabama, we have the Alabama Fish Farming Center in West Alabama with several cooperating agencies, including the Soil Conservation Service. We have an infrastructure of supply houses, places where there are products and chemicals for sale, equipment for sale. We also have one of the largest research facilities in the world here at Auburn, and this supports the industry throughout the Southeast, as well as other universities have similar support research facilities. Of course, the Agriculture Extension Service has specialists and agents working throughout the Southeast, and we have this in Alabama too, where our agents develop programs for the aquaculture industry, educational programs, and provide technical assistance. Now,
oh, I'm sorry, John, didn't mean to cut you off.
That's right.
The industry's is phenomenal growth, you know, 457 million pounds, but that was processed, and there's a lot of other available markets out there that you touched on, but I'd like you to tell people a little bit more about marketing.
That's right. The markets that we have today, we generally consider processor markets. And the processing that we did last year was worth 457 million pounds. Here in Alabama, I think we did around 55 million pounds. But much of our fish are sold in other ways. In fact, we estimate that there are 50 million pounds in the United States sold through niche markets and fee fishing markets. Certainly, processor markets are very, very important, but there are other ways to sell your fish, and everybody must investigate their marketing opportunities and choose the correct ones, and maybe even choose a multitude of these markets.
Yeah, it's amazing how many fish are sold to this fee fishing or live fishing market, just millions and millions of pounds every year. The other thing that I think people don't realize is the high degree of management. You brought that out in the video, but you know, catfish farming has been described as the most intensive form of large-scale agriculture done in the United States today. And I don't think people realize what it takes, and particularly like in the feeding. The feed is, you know, one of the biggest things. What do you find with new fish farmers as far as feeding goes?
That's an interesting question. In fact, I think one of the advice that we give to new fish farmers is to make sure you feed your fish. Sounds like a simple thing, but it's not as simple as feeding land animals. These fish are under the water, often invisible, and it makes it very difficult to feed the fish and understand how much they need to help make them grow and grow at the fastest rate. The way to do it, of course, is to feed them a little bit, and if they need more, require more, come to the surface for more feed, is to continue feeding them until we reach a point we call satiation, or about what they're going to eat at one time. New farmers often feed short of this. Of course, it costs a lot of money to feed, and people see the amount of money it takes, and they get frightened of that at times, and they hold back on the feed. If you hold back on the feed and you don't give them as much as they'll eat, you won't grow any fish. So if they're not eating and you're not feeding them enough, you're not going to make any money in the catfish business.
On a little further on that area, I guess, general area, there's a lot of misconception about how many pounds per acre of catfish are really grown out there, and I don't know how many times somebody will call and say, well, I want to grow 6,000 or 8,000 pounds of fish to the acre. Is that practical, and what is really grown on a per acre basis, John?
I guess in practical terms it is possible to grow 6,000 pounds to the acre, and there's a lot of what I call coffee shop talk in terms of how many catfish are produced on every farm or in every pond. I think if we looked at the southeastern average, we'd find that farmers produce about 3,500 pounds to the acre, quite a bit below what we see in published in budgets and in our own extension pamphlets. The reason for this is that there's a lot of risks involved in growing catfish that defer the harvest at times. Some of these risks, of course, include bird predation and death by disease, which means you lose numbers. And then other thing that happens in fish ponds is that we end up with a thing called off flavor. We have a bad flavor in the pond. These fish are not marketable. Processors check the flavor of each pond of fish before they buy that pond of fish. And if the flavor isn't suitable, farmers have to wait until the fish become on flavor again, and they can be marketed. And this may last 15 15 months or more. Therefore, we find that the fish harvest is delayed, and we really can't claim that we have 4,000 pounds grown per acre per year. This is more 4,000 pounds grown over a period of 15 months. Now, we're going to go to you for some crawfish information, Michael, and one of the things that I've heard about is that we know we have 150,000 acres of crawfish in this, of catfish in this country, and you got a lot of crawfish also in the United States. So tell us a little bit about this crawfish industry.
Right, John, thank you. Most people don't realize that we do have 150,000 acres of crawfish. Unfortunately, or fortunately for the Cajuns, I guess, it's mostly all in Louisiana. There's about 125,000 to 130,000 acres of crawfish in Louisiana. And first off, I want to thank LSU and Southern Louisiana and the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center for helping provide some of the video footage for this segment. When most people think about crawfish, I guess they think about swamps, and that's an important thing to remember, because part of the ecology of swamps tells us how the production of crawfish works, because swamps have wet and dry seasons. The water floods in the spring, dries out in the summer, and this cycle of wet and dry is the same cycle we will follow in the production sequence. There are a lot of different species of crawfish all around North America, but really when it comes to crawfish farming, the only ones that have made a big hit really in this country are the red swamp crawfish, and that's the one raised in Louisiana and throughout the southeast. In Louisiana, you have large acreage, like I said, 125,000 acres devoted to this. When you start talking about construction of crawfish ponds, similar to catfish, you've got to have heavily clayed soils. These animals burrow, and you have to have that clay. When you construct the pond, you're talking about a levee-type pond again, very flat, only about 18 to maybe 22 inches deep, maybe 12 inches of freeboard, and a slope of less than 6 inches. You also have to have well-maintained graveled levees for your transportation in and out of the pond. And probably the biggest single thing is water. It takes lots and lots of water to raise crawfish, whether it be well water or whether it be surface water. Many times the water is screened, so to remove any wild fish if it's surface water, and to aerate the water as you're pumping it into the ponds. These ponds, again, are big, open, shallow water ponds. They're prone to bird predation, but it's really not a big problem in the crawfish industry as it is in the catfish. The production cycle starts in about May. If you've got a new pond, you stock about 50 pounds of crawfish per surface acre. Then over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, you draw the pond down. This drawdown causes the crawfish to burrow in the ponds. Many producers like to put cardboard out in the edge of the ponds because it stimulates the crawfish to burrow more under the cardboard. Once the pond is drawn down, of course, the crawfish are burrowed in. We see the typical crawfish chimneys. And underneath this chimney is a burrow that may go down 2 or 3 feet. In the burrow, typically, there is a male and a female crawfish. And this is important because you're going to get reproduction in the burrow. And it's this reproduction, or these young crawfish, that are going to become the crop for this growing season. The female crawfish, of course, attaches the eggs to her swimmerets and holds them. And the key to reflooding the pond is to know when these eggs are ready to be released and the young crawfish are ready to grow. For food for the crawfish is provided by planting a forage crop, something like rice, sorghum Sudan, millet, during the summertime, and then usually in mid to late September, early October, the pond is reflooded. Again, this coincides with the young crawfish being hatched. The crawfish start consuming that forage crop, and as the season goes along into the fall and winter and early spring, that forage, that rice or whatever, is eaten up and the crawfish grow. A young crawfish can double its size every 2 weeks. If the temperature is right and it has enough forage, it'll molt and double in size. Many problems associated with crawfish production are water quality problems, particularly oxygen. And like catfish, crawfish farmers have to learn to manage oxygen, learn how to test for oxygen, and all that. The biggest cost in producing crawfish is harvesting costs, labor and bait. A single man harvesting crawfish traps can only harvest about 30 or 40 an hour. You put traps out at about 20 per acre, so you're really looking at a man only being able to harvest about 2 acres an hour, maybe 20 acres a day max. This leads to small crawfish producers. Typical type of trap that's used today in the industry is a pyramid trap. It's 3-sided, got little funnels on each side, baited. The crawfish go in the funnels and can't get out. They're caught live. In Louisiana, where you have large acreage, they've developed mechanical harvesters called crawfish combines, and these allow one man to harvest 150 or 250 traps an hour. Greatly increases his efficiency. These things have also been built where they can go over levees, you don't have to get out. Commonly used natural foods for trapping are things like shad and carp. Commonly used artificial baits are available, but it all depends on water temperature. One nice thing about the crawfish industry is that you're selling a live product. The farmer doesn't need processors. He can sell the live crawfish. Usually they're just put in onion sacks like this and sold at 35 or 40 pounds per sack. And of course that leads us to the great Cajun cooking that we're all getting excited about in this country. The traditional crawfish boil, or if the tail meat's extracted, then you've got things like crawfish pie, crawfish étouffée, jambalaya, all that wonderful Cajun cuisine that we all are wanting more and more of.
We've eaten some crawfish this week, haven't we? And it sure does look good. Michael, one of the things that I'm interested in is the production of crawfish in ponds. We both said that our industries that we're representing here today have about 150,000 acres each. And we know that in the catfish industry we produce somewhere around 4,000 pounds to the acre. Now, what is the situation with the crawfish? Is that somewhere in that ballpark too?
No, it's much, much less than that, John. With the crawfish industry, of course, you're planting a forage crop, and it's an animal that's going to consume that forage. And it really limits your production down to about, the average really probably is about 900 pounds per acre, although there are a lot of ponds that will only produce 400 or 500 pounds per acre, and there's the rare pond every once in a while where you'll get as much as a ton, 2,000 pounds per acre.
In other words, people can expect about 1,000 pounds to the acre, and that is a profitable production level, obviously.
Right. It's much less expensive to build the crawfish ponds because they're much shallower, being only 18 inches deep. So you're really talking pond construction cost of maybe only $1,000 an acre versus with the catfish, $3,000 an acre.
Do you happen to know the break-even point for crawfish production?
It's estimated at about 45 cents a pound.
45 cents a pound.
And most of that, though, is your labor cost and your bait. Every time you set a trap, you're putting a quarter to half a pound of bait in it, and that bait gets expensive, setting 20 traps to the acre. So it's over time, that adds up to a lot of money.
I've noticed, too, that Cajun cuisine is found everywhere in the country right now. It's very popular, and as I've been up in Maryland recently and in New Jersey and all, I've found it up there. Now, obviously, I've heard of some ponds. I have heard of some ponds going into production in Maryland and Delaware. If somebody is interested in investing in crawfish in the Midwest, for example, I just drove through Indiana last week and saw tremendous amounts of flat land. Seemed like good, appropriate crawfish farming area. Can you grow red swamp crawfish in the Midwest or any other northern areas of the United States?
It's a little hard to say. The red swamp really, the native range of it went up into about the southern tip of Illinois, so it's probably a little doubtful that we'd grow it much further north than that. But I know many universities, including Purdue, is looking at other species of native crawfish and looking for opportunities to grow those as food. Any crawfish should do, and it's like John said, this Cajun cuisine is really catching on. We did a study from Auburn just looking at where restaurants in 3 cities here in Alabama, being Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, and Montgomery, interested in buying crawfish, and they polled just seafood restaurants, and 80% of the seafood restaurants said that yes, if they had crawfish available, even though they knew it was seasonal from about January through May, they would buy 1,000 pounds of crawfish a week or so. So there's a tremendous market out there for Native American crawfish that's going really unanswered because the Cajuns eat 85% of everything they produce, so we just don't get many of them out of Louisiana.
Well, thank you. We've covered a lot of things here with the catfish industry and the crawfish industry in 5 minutes, but certainly we haven't covered everything that we needed to cover. I wonder if we have any questions yet. Purdue, do we have any questions yet?
John, we're waiting for I hear a little echo. Okay. John, we're waiting for we did flash up the number. I'll give it to you again. It's 1-800-743-4647. We're waiting for the phone calls now. We have people standing by, and if you're a little bit worried about being put on the air, we will write those questions down and read them off so you don't have to be put on the air. I have a couple questions for you, though, John. One, I have one on Channel Catfish. For example, here in the Midwest, we have a lot of people interested in getting into aquaculture. I think the industries are established more in the South than they are here in the Midwest. How would a potential fish farmer convince a lender to loan them money when there's no real track record?
It's very, very difficult to convince a lender to loan you money if you don't have a track record. Of course, sometimes our potential aquaculture producers are also are farmers in other areas. And lenders often know the farmer and the family and how well they've done in other crops, and sometimes this is an advantage when you're presenting a new commodity like catfish to the lender. It is difficult, and this is one of the major complaints I hear in new aquaculture areas where people are trying to get started is, how do I convince a lender to get me some money, to provide the money so I can make this operation go? Of course, I always tell our farmers down here is, don't go to the lender without a good plan in mind. Have your plan together, have your numbers laid out, work with your extension service, work with anybody that will provide you information and have all those numbers down, and then present the plan to the lender. And you're much more likely to get some attention from the lender if you can make a convincing case for it. And you've got to ask the lender is, you've got to tell the lender why they need to act quickly, and why you need to act quickly. You need to be able to show that to the lender so that you draw the interest of the lender and can you maybe get that money.
Okay, I have another question. This is directed to Michael. We hear a lot of talk about this new crawfish, giant crawfish that comes from Australia, I think. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what the status is down in Alabama and Louisiana?
Sure, I'd be happy to, LaDon. We've been studying some of the Australian crawfish now here at Auburn for about 4 or 5 years, and there's several species. The one species that we think has potential, and I say that has, maybe, with a question mark behind it, is the Australian red claw. It is actually a tropical species, so in many ways it's going to be like growing tilapia here in this country, in that it cannot tolerate our cold winters and it's going to die below about 50 degrees, and probably we'll have some disease problems when it gets down to 65 degrees or so. So you're going to have to actually raise it indoors or have an indoor greenhouse or something for it during the winter time, and then put it into ponds in the summer. But our research here at Auburn and with private producers around the state of Alabama is that you can start out with a 1-gram juvenile crawfish in about the middle of April, 1st of May, put it out in your ponds and harvest crawfish that are about 6 to the pound by the end of the growing season in October. And that's much, much bigger than our native crawfish and should fill a niche market for really a small lobster market. Right now we have 7 or 8 private hatcheries here in the state of Alabama producing red claw crawfish. The interesting thing is that they're all going right now to the aquarium industry. They're really not going into food production.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. We have a call in from Pennsylvania, and the gentleman asked, is there a directory for niche markets in the U.S., and if so, can anyone find them? Where would you go to find them? And this person's interested specifically for New York and Pennsylvania. And this two-part question, if I could ask the second one, how much processing, if any, is usually required before taking a fish to the niche market?
Well, I guess that's my question. That's a real good question that the viewer asked. I guess as far as a directory goes for niche markets, you may find that in the states that he referenced, you may find that the Extension Service specialists there or county agents have an idea what these niche markets may be. On the other hand, you may also find that you can refer to some of the trade magazines like Seafood Leader or Seafood Business. They often have a good listing of some of the wholesalers and buyers of seafood in your area. You can also go to your local telephone book and start looking for the wholesalers, restaurants, and other potential outlets. It's something that the grower usually has to be responsible for when you're looking at niche markets. Has to spend the time hunting up those niche markets, and it's a lot of work. Growing the fish is difficult, but finding the market sometimes is more difficult, but can be very rewarding. And the other question was, can you repeat that again, LaDon? I can't remember that question.
Sure. The question was, how much processing? I think the caller was asking, can you sell the fish live, or do you have to process the fish somewhat before they can be sold in those niche markets?
That, of course, is part of the investigation that the grower has to do. We find out what they want. Of course, you find out what the consumer wants, and you give the consumer the product just that way. And if the restaurant requires that the fish is completely processed with all of the skin removed, for example, off of catfish, in a certain way, you provide it that way, as long as that person is reasonable, that buyer is reasonable, and can still provide you with a profit. Sometimes some of these small-scale processors just can't provide everything that the consumer wants or that the buyer wants. But you need to find out what everybody wants, and sometimes it doesn't fit into the small-scale processor's program either. You just can't do everything. But often it takes some investigation, but you'll find good niche markets everywhere across the United States. Everybody likes to buy fish that are fresh yesterday, or swimming this morning, grown in a local county, things like that, and they'll usually pay a little better price for fish of that sort.
Okay, we're going to ask one last question. I think it's a great question, and in regard to growing catfish along with tilapia in the same ponds.
Those are really good questions, LaDon. I guess I can handle the question. I could have referred it to Michael here, I guess, too, but I heard somebody tell me about it the other day. I guess that's why I started on it. Catfish and tilapia can be grown together, and there's been a lot of research on this over the last 20 years about growing catfish and tilapia and other species in what we call polyculture, more than one species. It sounds pretty interesting. It does work. It can be more profitable, but it often interferes with our harvesting and our marketing strategies. Tilapia themselves, of course, if they are a mixed gender, or males and females together, they'll reproduce like mad in a pond, in a catfish pond, and they'll provide you with a lot of fish that cannot be sold to the processing plants. They're too small, and they may end up with the catfish. Requires a lot of sorting. The processors today are processing so many catfish, they don't want to be bothered with the mix of tilapia if it's going to a processing plant. On the other hand, if it's going to a local niche market, and you have the labor to sort these things out, there's nothing wrong with that. We have some growers here who grow some tilapia in cages in catfish ponds. That's probably the best way, is to containerize them, contain them. Tilapia grow very, very well in cages, fairly easy to produce. Then that way they can be separated. We also grow some bighead carp, which is a Chinese carp, and grass carp together with catfish. But because of the relatively large size of bighead carp and grass carp, we can sort those out as we go to the processing plant with our fish. So those are good questions, and they just have to be studied very carefully. You always have to go on out and get other people's opinions on these things, and we're never afraid of taking on these questions and trying to answer them. All over the United States, we have extension specialists and other people that are willing to answer these people's questions. So we hope that we'll continue to get good questions like that.